I was thinking, first of all, this afternoon, it would be really fun to go until about 6:30 tonight, just to see the reaction as we're talking about patience. But secondly, I was excited. I made my way to the La Fiesta today. And if you don't know me and Mexican food, when I get in my car at the house, if I turn on the Google Maps on the screen, it gives me two options of where it thinks I'm going. One of them is 508 West 18th, which is what it addresses the little alley between the office and Thorin's house, which is where I park my car every day. Or secondly, La Fiesta Mexican Restaurant is the other option it gives me. And during all of this COVID isolation and all that stuff, and because I happened to not go there 2 Sundays ago, it's been like 3 weeks, and I think I was suffering withdrawals and needing rehab or something. But finally made it there today, had a good Mexican lunch, and then thought, you know, after the COVID and the coughing and the throat and all that stuff, a snow cone sounds like the best thing in the world right now. And so I said, would you like a snow cone? My wife said, sure, we'll get snow cones. And so I went to the snow cone place. The Snow Oasis over there on, I think it's on Main Street. I pull in, and there is a minivan in front of me. If it was one of you, I apologize now. There was a minivan in front of me, and it was parked there, tinted windows. I could only assume because there's a man inside who's embarrassed to be driving a minivan. But anyway, he's sitting there and looking at the menu that is before you pull up to the window at Snow Oasis. Believe me, if I could have had dark tinted windows on my Dodge Caravan back in the day, I would have been all over that. Anyway, there's this giant menu at Snow Oasis. And the last time we were there, my wife actually commented, there are all these names of flavors that we have no idea what they are. Which is why I order cherry every time, because I know what cherry is. I have no idea what tiger's blood or cougar's something, or I don't know any of those things. And I could only imagine that everyone seated in the minivan was discussing every flavor that is on, and there are literally 80 of them probably. And so I'm imagining this going on in this minivan and thinking to myself, how long am I supposed to wait? Is there a point in this where, and I've noticed now that cars have started pulling up behind me too, and I thought, what do I do? And also in the back of my mind the entire time is, I'm preaching about patience 4 hours from now, and I can't do too much of anything. I do have 4-wheel drive. I could just like push, I guess, but I didn't know exactly what to do, and I thought just a light tap, just to let them know. And I probably waited 2 or 3 minutes first, but I thought, okay, I have to do something, and so just a little bit of a tap, and then they gradually start to move forward. And I thought to myself, God has a sense of humor and knows that we're talking about patience tonight. Now, for me, that is the time where most of my impatience comes out. It's stuff like that. Honestly, usually with the really big stuff, I kind of anticipate it's going to take a while. I've been working for churches for like 20 years now, and I know that anything in churches takes a while. That's kind of the nature of things. And so I have along the way learned to just be patient with big processes and ideas and all of that. But the little mundane day-to-day stuff, that gets under my skin sometimes and really tests my patience. So I don't want to talk as much about that because I'm not good at it, first of all. And secondly, I don't know that that's really what's being driven at biblically. Not that we shouldn't be better about that than we are, but I think what God is looking for us is patience with the things that matter a little bit more. So let's look, as we have throughout the series, at patience as Webster defines it. First of all, bearing pains or trials calmly or without complaint. Now, I don't want to put too much weight on the without complaint side for a couple reasons. I think we're going to see a lot of Bible examples of patience accompanied by complaint. I hope that the complaint side doesn't characterize everything we're doing. I hope it's not the overriding thing. But even, as Jared mentioned in class this morning, in his class on patience, when you look at Job does a lot of complaining, doesn't he? I mean, that's a pretty good chunk of that book, is either Job or his friends complaining about what God's doing. And then quite honestly, when you get to the end of it, when God is giving his defense and explaining who he is, there's a little bit of even what God is doing that sounds like complaining about what Job has been doing. And so there's some complaining that goes on. That's a piece of it, and I hope we don't get overwhelmed by complaining. But mainly, it's the side of this that is the bearing pains or trials calmly. And for some of us, calm is nature. And for some of us, calm is everything against our nature. And so to find that calm can be difficult. Secondly, manifesting forbearance under provocation or strain. And you have likely in life somewhere along the way been there, where it seems like everything around you is just difficult. There's a lot of strain on you, whether it's the amount of time or the amount of effort you're having to put forward, and to somehow maintain through that. Third, not hasty or impetuous, which is to say, how soon do you hit that horn at the Snowasis? How long do you wait for something to begin to go bad before you react to it? How much are you willing to sit and think about people and what they're going through and what's happening in their lives before you assume it's all about you or all about me? Fourth, steadfast despite opposition, difficulty, or adversity. And maybe this is one that really applies in our world nowadays, because we feel like we're surrounded by this and meeting this all the time. And how do we deal when we have opposition and adversity? Are we steadfast through that? And then last, able or willing to bear. Now, I think that we're all able. Now, I don't know that that ability necessarily comes from us. I think God gives us that through the Spirit, but He would not ask us to do something that we could not do. And so when God says to us to be patient, He wouldn't ask us to do that if it was not a possible thing. So we do have the ability. The question for us is a little more, do we have the willingness? In a world that says you should have everything your way right now, do we have the willingness to live differently than that and instead live as God has called us to live? So let's look at a few things about patience in Scripture. First of all, God is patient. And if we want to be more like He designed us to be, this is something we should be as well. In 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, it says, "The Lord is not slow to fulfill His promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance." Even all the way back as Peter is writing there in the first century, people are beginning to struggle with, why is Jesus not back yet? You know, if you think we're thinking of 2,000 years later, why has this not happened yet? They were already there just within a couple decades. They thought He's going to show up at any time. And Peter says to them, you know, this is not God being slow, this is God being patient. Because if He showed back up tomorrow, think of all the people who have not yet heard the message. Think of all the people who still think that this was just a false prophet who has been put to death. This is a movement that we need to squelch and get out of the way. And instead, they would gradually over time begin to figure out who He is. And even now, as much as we may look at our world and think, it's such a mess, we're about ready to be done with this and it's good for Him to come back, if He is patient to allow us the opportunity to tell more people about Him. And then we also know that Jesus is patient. We see that lived out quite a bit throughout His life, don't we? How many times, if you were Jesus and the people around you reacted to what you were doing or saying in the way that they did, would you just kind of want to roll your eyes and sigh and just think, do you guys not get it yet? How many miracles do I have to do? How many times do I have to give the same teaching? And yet He patiently comes over and over again back to these same lessons so that they can learn them. In Matthew 17, verse 17, Jesus answered, and this is after He's come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. Here's this demon-possessed kid down here with his dad that needs healing. And Jesus responds this way, "Faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me." This is, by the way, one of those stories that's in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. Jesus has the patience of all that is going on around Him and all this glory He just came down from to still want to help this person out. Paul will talk about the patience of Jesus in 1 Timothy. It says, "But I received mercy for this reason, that in me, as the foremost, Jesus Christ might display His perfect patience as an example to those who were to believe in Him for eternal life." So Jesus' patience is being shown through Paul and what he does. And if it's being shown through Paul, it can be shown through us in how we live and how we react to others. Patience is evidence of the Spirit's presence. Now, we saw that this morning. If you weren't here this morning, we talked about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. And there in the midst of that list of things that are the fruit of the Spirit is patience. We also read about it in Colossians chapter 1. Paul says, "And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to His glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy." There in the midst of all of these things we will receive, all of these things we're called to do, is patience. So the more I look at it, I'm beginning to see that patience is not just one of those things that, man, it would be great if we were better at that, wouldn't it? It's one of those things I really should try to put some effort into and get better about. it really is an essential piece of who we are to be. There in the midst of all of these lists of important things of love and joy and peace, there we find patience right in the midst of it. Patience is also essential to good relationships. Jared talked about that quite a bit in class this morning with the marriage relationship. How many times have you appreciated the patience of your spouse? Or maybe how many times have you really just wished for a little more patience from your spouse because you know they're going to need it with whatever's about to happen? We know that patience is important to a relationship. In Proverbs 19 and verse 11, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is for glory to overlook, it is his glory to overlook an offense. In Colossians 3 and verse 12, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. We are to be people who put on patience in everything that we do. And I love the language there, by the way, of put on patience. It's almost as if we're getting ready for the day and putting on all of the things we put on, and here's another layer of who we are to be. We are to put on patience because most days you're going to need it, aren't you? Most days there's going to be something that comes along to test your patience, whether it's big or small. Patience is also needed in the church. Now, I like to think that it's not one of those things that is, but you have probably run across that at one point or another with a brother or sister where you just feel like, okay, I'm going to have to slow down, I'm going to have to take a deep breath, and I'm going to have to work my way through whatever this is patiently, because we don't always see things in the same way, do we? We have different opinions, different ideas, and because of that, there's a need for patience. In Ephesians 4 and verse 1, Paul says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Notice, by the way, this is the second time already tonight that we've seen Paul talking about walking in this worthy manner, and in the midst of that worthy manner, we find patience. With all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So we are bearing with one another in love. Love allows us to assume the best of each other, to look for good intentions rather than assuming bad intentions. And then also we are eager for unity. Unity is not something that we hope for or that we wish might happen. We are eager for it. And I don't know about you, but when I am eager for something, the tendency is I will try to do things to help whatever that thing is happen. And so Paul says to us, be eager for this, eager for unity. And then he also says in 1 Thessalonians 5, and we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. Admonish the idle. I like where he begins there because we have probably all experienced this somewhere along the way, have we not? Where you have seen someone who is not doing the job as hard as you would do the job. When you see someone that just seems like they're just putting in the time, punching the time clock, but they're not really all that invested in what it is they're doing, whether it is in work or in family things or in church things. And Paul says here to admonish, but in the midst of that, to do it patiently. I think Paul intentionally chooses things here that normally we may not think to handle patiently. Normally, when we're admonishing the idle, isn't it because we have lost our patience with them? Normally, when we are helping the weak, isn't it because we're just thinking, why don't you just do this? And then you come in and you think, all right, I'll help. I'll do something. In the midst of all of these times where we lose our patience, Paul says, do these things, but do them patiently. Because isn't that the way that you would want to be dealt with? Do you want someone to come along and yell at you and point out all the things that you're doing wrong that you probably realize you're doing wrong anyway? Or do you want someone to pick you up and dust you off and walk alongside you and help you through to where you need to be? Patience is also needed for good leadership. And you have probably encountered along the way in life leadership that involves patience and leadership that doesn't. You probably encountered a lot of leadership that's kind of a kick in the pants and yell at you kind of leadership, and maybe leadership that has instead walked alongside or maybe served. In 2 Timothy verse 4, Paul is encouraging Timothy to lead, and he says, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who has judged the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. So you do all these instructive things, but you're to do them patiently. I've heard the joke a couple times about this new preacher that comes to town And he preaches just a great sermon the first Sunday morning. Everybody is so excited that he has preached it. He gets all these handshakes in the back, and everybody tells him what a good job he's done. And the next Sunday, everybody shows up, and he preaches exactly the same sermon. People have got their notebooks out and their Bibles, and they're starting to look and, hang on a second. This is the same thing we heard last week. And so nobody wanted to say anything. They thought, well, maybe he forgot, maybe he didn't realize. And so they're still shaking his hand, good sermon, all that. They get to week 3. And he preaches exactly the same sermon again. And now they're beginning to wonder what in the world's going on. And so someone finally comes up to him and says, you know, you preached that sermon the first week and again the second week and then this week. Why? And he said, well, you guys haven't got it yet. And then I'll just keep preaching it until you get it. And I thought, you know, we have to instruct each other, but we do it patiently with the understanding we're not all going to get it the first time. We're not all going to understand it all, and at times we're going to forget. Those times when you feel like I've got patience down, a lot of times it will come back and you realize, no, I'm not quite as patient as I thought I was. You, however, have followed my teaching in 2 Timothy 3:10. You have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, and my steadfastness. How great would it be if all of us could live patiently in such a way that the people around us could see that example and learn from it? And we don't so much have to tell someone to be patient, but they can see it happening within our lives. And then Christians are called to be patient. So if all these other examples of it have not been enough for us, this is something we are actually told to do. In James chapter 5 and verse 7 and 8, James says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until he receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." And so we understand with the idea of crops, that crop just doesn't come up immediately. There is a patience that comes with it. And here, as James tells us to be patient, it is an imperative. It's a command. James says, you be patient. This is something you're commanded to do. And then Paul in Romans 12 says this, "Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality." And Paul, instead of going the imperative route, the command route, even though it looks like that in English, what Paul does is he uses a whole bunch of participles. So what Paul is actually saying here is rejoicing, being patient, being constant, contributing, and seeking. These are who you are. They are what you're doing as you're doing other things. This is just part of your life. So patience shows itself not just in the effort to be patient, but as you're working, as you're parenting, as you're being a child being parented, as you're teaching, or as you're a student, whatever role in life you may have, patience makes its way into that part of life, which is why, as we talked about this morning, patience isn't just something we do, it becomes who we are. It comes out of our hearts and makes its way into all parts of our lives. So as we bring all this together, I want us to look at a biblical example of patience, and I don't want us to go the route we often go with this with Job. I want us to look at Abraham for a number of reasons. It's a pretty familiar story to us. There are a lot of ups and downs within the life of Abraham. But what you find in the life of Abraham is not everything being done the right way all the time. And I feel often that when we are trying to be patient, or when we feel like I do, that we are not patient enough, and this is one of those things I don't feel like I should be talking about because I'm just not that good at it, we should recognize that this is not something we're going to get right every time. And Abraham doesn't. We can see that in his story. And yet, as you look at the overall scope of his life and direction of his life, I believe you see patience not just from his side, but also from God's side in the midst of it all. So we begin in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 12, the Lord said, and he's Abram still at this point. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. I will not ask everyone who is 75 or older to raise your hand, but you know who you are. Could you imagine for a moment if God came to you and said, "I want you to leave everything you know and go to a new place"? What would that be like? What would it be like? You would have all these questions running through your mind of how this is supposed to work and what you're supposed to do, and you don't even know yet where it is you're going. You have probably, during the course of your life, visited somewhere along the way where you thought, I could live here. I like Ada, I like where I'm at, but this would be a neat place to live. Or you've probably visited other places that you thought to yourself, I would never in a million years want to live in this place. What would it be like to know that you're about to leave, and it could be either of those? It could be the most amazing place in the world, or a place that you would just not want anything to do with going there. But we learn about Abram is that he gets up and he goes. And this is, I don't know how you can see hopefully you can see the arrows there. This is the journey that Abram takes in life. Think about the distance covered here for a minute of just how long these people on feet, or maybe some animals here and there, would have to just go and go and go. And not young people, but Abram at age 75, making this journey along the way. And we've already talked about the importance of patience within relationships. How many times do you think Sarai said to Abram, where is it we're going again? And how many times do you think that Abram said to Sarai, I don't know. We're just going. And how many times do you think Sarai said to the people around her, can you believe this? We're just going. We don't even know where we're going, but we're going. My feet are tired. We've been going for a long time. And there are probably times where Abram felt the same way of, are we there yet? Is this the place we should get to? And they just go off on this journey. And then we find Abram. He struggles with lies. And when we think of the patience or obedience or faithfulness of whatever you want to think of Abram, you don't think of someone who would struggle with the idea of lying, but that's what we find with Abram. As he goes into another place, it says when he's about to enter Egypt, in chapter 12 and verse 11, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. And by the way, just as a sidebar here, Abram 75, Sarai 65. Ladies, when your husband tells you that you are the most beautiful person he knows, he is not lying. He really believes that. Abram is so sure of this, he's afraid for his life because of this. And so he has decided, well, the best way to handle this is to lie if we get into trouble. And he will do this, by the way, not just this time in chapter 12, but on down the road in the journey too. He comes back to the same mistake again. Because there are times, even though he is on this journey trying to be obedient, there are times where, like an awful lot of us, he feels like, but I've got to grab control of this. Because I don't know where this is going, and this is something that we can control. And so here, let's do it in this way. And it causes all kinds of trouble for him. Then we find out he also has family troubles that are going on. We read about Abram and Lot in chapter 13. It says that Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. And so we learn that they've got all these herds and they've got all this stuff, and there is not enough space in this one place they want to be for everybody to be happy and get along. And so they decide they're going to need to kind of go their separate ways so everyone can have space and get along. And I think to myself, we're just this far into the journey now. And Abram has already had, we don't know where we're going. We're kind of, we're at an age where this is kind of a hard thing to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to tell my wife about this. Now we're going into a place where I feel danger, and so we lie to get out of that danger, and that causes even more trouble. And now even family is becoming a problem. And in all of this, what we see from Abram is he keeps going. He has this patience with God's plan that even in the moments where he does things his own way, he still sticks along with God and keeps doing what he's going to do. And then we have part 2 of Abram's issues going on with Lot, where there are these people in the other land that are just causing trouble for them, and he has to go out and rescue. And down in chapter 14 and verse 16, it says that he brought back all the possessions and brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. And somewhere along the way, I imagine, at least if I'm Abram, I'm saying, well, God, if you have sent me out somewhere that I don't even know where that is yet, could some of this at least be a little easier than it is? Could you pave the way? Make it so that we can get there in safety and everything go well, but instead, we have all of this drama going on. And now this family that we're not getting along great with and had to separate, I've got to go back and rescue them. And why does everything have to be so hard? But instead of that, what we see from Abram is he just kind of continues on with the plan that God has for him. So then God reminds him in chapter 15, because he's begun to wonder, I don't know how this is supposed to work because we're getting older and it doesn't seem like things are happening. And where is my heir supposed to come from? Is it going to be these servants? Who's the heir going to be? And God says to him in verse 5, it says, he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you were able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And every now and then, God just comes along with these reminders for Abram. I think God does this for us. Now, I wish God would come up to the tent sometimes and drag us outside and point to the sky and show us something. But God shows us in other ways. God shows us that he is with us. God shows us that he is working. And so he shows Abram, I have not forgotten the plan. And Abram patiently continues to go along. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. But then, just a short time later, we have Sarai beginning to lose patience a little bit with the plan. And Sarai said to Abram in chapter 16, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, that it may be as I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so he goes to Hagar, and they have Ishmael. And God says, no, this is not what I had in mind. You're going to have a child with Sarai in a different way. And Abram, I think, still feels like he's trying to go along with the plan and is just trying to find different solutions in different ways, but still trying to go along, be patient with what God is doing. So God said to Abraham down in chapter 17, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations, kings of people shall come from her. And now we've reached a point where not only do the things that God is telling him, not only are not all the answers there, but now they don't really make sense in a human way. Because the idea that Abram and Sarai would be having kids at this point, that doesn't fit. That's not something that happens. And they don't know what to do with that. And what we find out in chapter 17 is their reaction is laughter. You ever reach that point where everything is going so badly, not according to the plan that you have in mind, that all you can do is just kind of laugh? I have had times where there's a series of things you're trying to do in a process, and as you go to each step of the process, something else goes wrong, and you kind of hit that point where you could just either laugh or cry, and so you just laugh. Usually that's the point where someone comes into the room and assumes you've lost your mind or something, but you would just kind of laugh. And Abram and Sarah, their reaction is, this doesn't happen. This is not how it works. And yet they still patiently go along with God. And then in the midst of all of it, with all of the family drama going on, then they find themselves around this incredibly worldly place of Sodom and Gomorrah, where all this sin is going on. And Abram finds himself in a place where he is actually kind of bartering with God. Well, what if we could just find this many good people there? God says, okay, I'll save it for that many people. But what if it's just a few less? Well, okay. And he keeps bartering down until it seems like a very small, doable number, but we learn very quickly just how bad Sodom and Gomorrah is. And so God destroys these towns. And then down in chapter 20, we find him in the midst of another lie, just like that one back from chapter 12. Sarah, you are Sarah now. You're so beautiful. These people are going to take you and kill me. Tell them you're my sister. Just tell them this is who you are so that they won't kill me. And even now, by the way, further along in years, he still thinks she's just that beautiful. This is going to be a problem. And so he concocts this lie again, and again the lie gets him into trouble. And then we find our way down to Abraham and Isaac. What God has been saying all along, and here it is. How long would it take for us before we begin to doubt it? How long would it take for people today before they just shake their head and walk away and say, you know, God has been saying the same thing for a long time, but I'm not seeing the results. This is not what I thought it was going to be. How many people that formerly followed Jesus, is that what happened in their minds? They thought to themselves, you know, I thought this was going to be one thing. I thought this was the promise of God and the promise of Scripture, and it has just not turned out the way it needed to. And how many times do you just wish if you just could be patient with God and see where he's heading? See what he's doing, see where he's going. And that's where we find Abraham in chapter 21. It says that the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. What do you suppose that celebration was like? How excited do you think those parents were? That after all of these years, finally here he is. When I was a junior in high school, I had an English teacher, Ross Gallagher. He was a very entertaining guy. He was a lot of fun with English, and we'd have all kinds of debates in English classes of all places. Ross Gallagher and his wife Teresa had been married for 9 years when I had him as a teacher. What I didn't realize until midway through my junior year was for that entire 9 years, they wanted desperately to have a child, and it just was not happening for them. They just prayed, and they just desperately wanted to have a child, and they were not having a child. And then about midway through the fall of my junior year, they found out they were going to have a baby. And I remember the bulletin board in Ross Gallagher's classroom suddenly changed from things about English and Shakespeare to things about the baby that was on the way. And he had, copies of ultrasound pictures, and they had, when they found out it was going to be a girl, it's a girl, and there was pink stuff all over it. And when they had a name, the name went up there, and and when that baby finally came along, it was as if someone was being added to our family. There was so much excitement. And I remember just seeing the excitement in their family and thinking, how much more with Abraham and Sarah, who have heard this promise for so long, and here comes this child along. And you will now do anything you can to make this child's life good and to protect this child and to give this child what I would imagine. I don't know how exactly you spoil a child back in Abraham's day, but I imagine Isaac had the best of whatever Isaac could have. And Isaac's life was as good as Abraham and Sarah could make it. And then the sacrifice comes along. And in chapter 22, it says that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. What in the world? As I'm thinking of Abraham, what are all the things going through his mind at this point? Because I will tell you that the bold Abraham a few chapters earlier that was bartering with God about how many people in Sodom, there's a part of me here that would be thinking, God, there's some perfectly good animals right over there, but we could sacrifice. God, you remember this is the child of the promise that we've talked about. This doesn't make any sense. And instead what we find Abraham doing is he starts out for the journey, and he's going. And we find Abraham on the mountain with Isaac, ready to do the thing that God has told him to do, and we find God stopping him from doing that, and God providing the lamb for him. The story of Abraham is such an interesting story with all of the ups and downs. This son that came along finally in his old age, that he thought he was about to lose in the name of the sacrifice to God, but is then again gifted back to him, that he's not going to have to lose him after all. And I think through all of this, we see not just the faithfulness of Abraham, but the patience of Abraham. I want you to think again about the definition we looked at as we started. What is patience? Bearing pains or trials calmly or without complaint. When we see the biggest complaints out of Abraham is when God is going to do something to somebody else. I know there are times where he lies, he tries to take control. I know there are times where he thinks this isn't working, so I have to force the issue a little bit, but he's still going along with God's plan in his mind. The one time it seems like there's a complaint is, God, you can't wipe out these towns. That's not okay. What if there are this many good people? Manifesting forbearance under provocation or strain. Going through times of war, rescuing your kin who could not get along with you before that you had to separate from, taking the journey to go sacrifice your son. How much strain was this man under? And yet patiently he bears through it all. Not hasty or impetuous. Now this is the one where you might argue just a little bit. It seemed like every now and then there were times where Abraham was just like, well, let's do it this way. But I would imagine there was a little bit of time that went into that. I don't think that Abram just immediately thought, let's lie about who you are. I imagine an Abram going through all these different things in his mind and then finding himself to, this really seems kind of like the best option, even though it wasn't. Steadfast despite opposition, difficulty, or adversity. Pretty difficult life, isn't it? Making that long journey as an old guy, going along and facing these different people who are opposing what you're trying to do, and even at times feeling like this promise that God has told me about, I just don't see it developing in the way that it should. But then what we really see out of Abram is this fifth one. He is able and willing to bear it? And maybe that's the question for us as we think about patience. Are you able and willing to bear it? Because if you think that you're not able, I believe that you have bought a lie. I think you are able. I think you would surprise yourself sometimes, but I think more than that, God would surprise you with what He has given you the ability to do. Whatever He has placed before you, you are able to get through it. The question for us is much more, are we willing? Whether it's good or bad, bumpy or smooth, fast or slow, whatever it may be, are we willing to go along on this journey with God? Because if we are, as we read of Abram, it's counted to him as righteousness. It will be counted to you as righteousness if you were patiently willing to go along with God on the journey that He has in mind for you. Now, you may be at a point in life right now where you just feel like you are out there wandering around. You don't know where you're going. Maybe you feel like you've had that call that Abram had early on, and you still don't know where it is you're supposed to go to. Know that God is willing there to walk alongside you and help you along the journey. If you have never started out on that road, God has called you to a life that is so much better than the lives you see lived around us in the world, that have so much more meaning than those lives. You can live a life that is changed for Him today. If there's something we can do in your life to help you along that way, if there are things that we can pray about in your life, or if we can just patiently bear with one another and live more for Him, please come while we stand and sing.